Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Scrollers podcast. Very excited to be hanging out with you guys again today. Excited to talk about historicism today. That's going to be an interesting topic. And I have, as usual, joined with me Yondar, good friend Yondar. How are you doing today, Yondar?
I'm great.
Excellent.
Doing well.
So what are your thoughts on this very interesting topic with historicism, and is it even worth it? Is it even relevant for today? Should we be doing philosophy from the historicist framework? What are your thoughts?
So historicism is it's a fascinating topic, I guess, because on the one hand, it's been, as much as a philosophical idea can never be falsified, historicism has been falsified. To save time, I won't present all the arguments, but suffice it to say there's been dozens of pretty major logical and empirical holes poked through every variety of historicism, and it's no longer considered academically acceptable to adhere to historicism. In another sense, however, the individuals who did adhere to historicism in the past did so because they were wrangling with serious existential or epistemological questions. And I think it's a mistake to just throw out the baby with the bathwater and not look at what questions were they trying to answer when they came up with historicism. So then we risk failing to answer those questions too.
Good points. Yeah. So I have up here historicism in three varieties. So what do you have to say about those?
So conventionally, we can group most variants of historicism, the view that worldviews or ideas are historically contingent or historically dependent phenomena, into three categories. The first and most well-known is the March of Progress, the idea that things are getting better and better as we proceed from one idea to the next, with us finally chancing upon the ultimate true idea. In its secular form, this is best known from the theories of Auguste Comte, which is where we go from the mythological to the theological to the metaphysical to the scientific worldview. Early positivism. There are several religious versions of this too. Dispensationalism, for instance, in the Baha'i and Methodist strain. Of course, slightly oversimplified. Academically, this worldview collapsed in, say, between the early and the middle part of the 20th century, and it's sort of given way to a type of post-narrative historicism, which preserves the preserves the theory that ideas are derived from history, but denies a ordering or hierarchical value to these ideas. But historically, the most influential form of historicism in the universities, and the ones we're going to be focusing on, is the German school of historicism, best associated with Hegel and, to a lesser extent, with Schelling. It's implicit in the writings of Marx, and in Hegel this was derived from a variant of Lutheran millenarianism, which asserted that the final idea is implicit from the very beginning of the great chain of ideas and present throughout. And Hegel conceives of the task of the philosopher to be, in some respects, rescue this final idea from out of history. Marx inverts this schema in his own theories of Marxist or historical materialism. I'm just mentioning that for the record. We won't be touching on it, though, because... So, Marx's theory of history entailed that Western Europe, which was the most industrialized area, would have a Marxist revolution first, and then it would expand concentrically to embrace the rest of humanity. For those who have never taken a single history class, that never happened. And this led to Marxist historians having to reevaluate what did they mean by historical materialism, which has led to a dizzying variety of versions of historical materialism, many of which are completely incompatible with each other. Nothing against any of these views, and some of them are worth studying on their own accord, like that of Walter Benjamin, but we will skip over it for the sake of time, and also because you're basically dealing with mystic intimate form, which call like the how do you put this? You know the meme that Marxism is the political equivalent of Pastor Jim's First Reformed Baptist Church?
No, I don't. Do explain.
Yeah, so it's the meme, like, Marxists, it's a collective philosophy that entails mass revolution, revolution of the masses. And yet Marxists themselves are almost mystical individualists who often have highly distinct and very idiosyncratic schools between, say, the visions of historical materialism as viewed by G.A. Cohen versus, say, Slavoj Žižek versus, say, Terry Eagleton versus, say, Walter Benjamin. And this means that Marxists, I mean, people joke about like how they fight all the time, but whether they fight or don't fight, it's a major problem with studying Marxism is you're trying to study a collectivist philosophy run by people who are the exact opposite of collectives, and that much like Pastor Jim's First Reformed Baptist Church, every time there's some minute disagreement, a second Pastor Jim's First Reformed Baptist Church appears down the street with 20% of the original congregation.
That's a great point. Yeah, apt comparison. The meme stands up to criticism.
Yeah. So, as I said, some of these are absolutely worth studying, but on their own, and they're not quite as relevant for, say, a study of their effect on history because of how highly individual they've been. So with that in mind, we're going to switch to why do we want to study historicism with our three schools-ish. We can divide those three schools into dozens of others. And the answer is, I mentioned historicism has been almost universally rejected de jure. Like, if you ask any academic, is there a grand theory of history governing events which will manifest in the final historical salvation, be it Hegelian or Marxist or positivist or progressive, you're going to get a no. Even from people who might identify as positivists, Marxists, or progressives. With that being said, it's an extraordinary central component of what you call like the modern mythological worldview. You see it just show up constantly all the time. Like if you look at online discussions or news discussions, when you see people appealing to like the right side of history, or I can't believe we're still debating, say, abortion rights in 2024. Or if you go into the university system, you'll see, well, we can no longer, sentences like, we can no longer adhere to naive theories about what was the example I wanted to pick here? We can no longer adhere to naive theories about the translucence of language. I see this sentence show up a lot in philosophy of language, and it's implicit is simply the notion of a historical development of philosophy, whose conclusions we have to wrangle with.
Mm-hmm.
None of that's true. Like, I mean, obviously the quotes are false, but the idea, in one sense, we're the product of our ancestors, right? Like, they have a profound influence on us. I agree, we shouldn't ignore that intellectually, because subconsciously we're going to struggle to ignore that. With that being said, the idea that we therefore have to engage with their ideas is simply false. You can look at this in history with how many major philosophical issues have vanished, not because we came up with a solution to them, but because people just lost interest in answering the question. And then it'll show up again 600 years later. This keeps happening with the problem of the continuation of personal identity, for instance. Medieval scholastics were interested in it. Renaissance philosophers weren't, and then it showed up again in the early Reformation period, or the late early modern period in the writings of like John Locke, which is where the modern starting point of the problem of identity. But John Locke wasn't especially interested in medieval solutions, so we're not even looking at a continuation between there. Hence the quote from the Colombian political theorist Nicolas Gómez de Vila: "History does not solve problems; it buries them." And we have the same concern from Walter Benjamin, which is just because we bury the problem, it's not gone, right? Like the problem of the continuation of personal identity did not cease to be a problem just because Petrarch was not interested in answering it. And second quote here. This is from Walter Benjamin's essay on Marxist historical materialism, which is worth reading, even if we're not going to touch on it too much here, which is the image of the past that we don't recognize as our own concerns threaten to disappear from us in an irretrievable fashion.
Yeah, fascinating.
This isn't actually a... Oh, sorry.
No, just reinforcing your point. That's really interesting.
Yeah. In one sense, this is bad because it means we do have the potential to ignore problems we should be paying attention to. The issue of... I picked the translucence of language because this is something that a lot of people don't want to wrangle with. Sorry, for those who are unaware what I'm talking about, this is the issue of it in how words correspond to ideas. Not necessarily like profound philosophical ideas like chair. The word chair versus the chair that can be conceived by no words. Naive theories of language tend to presuppose some degree of identity between the word and the concept, but that is... Those naive ideas break down when you start analyzing them, and this leads to a dizzying variety of potential considerations on the relation between language and thought. Many of them disastrous, but still an interesting question. So in one sense this is bad. In another sense this is good, though, because it means that we can use our imaginative faculty to engage with a lot of questions in the past, like outside the stream of history. So, like, let's say you walk into, where you guys use Barnes and Nobles as your main bookstore.
Sadly, well, I don't know. Do Americans use books? Like that would be the main. If there's a bookstore in your area, it's probably Barnes and Nobles. Yeah.
Okay, so if you go into the business section, you'll leadership, advice, management. You'll always find books on like the samurai or art of war, whatever. The Art of War, Musashi's The Five Rings, how you can apply this to business leadership. It's the big in thing right now because there's a lot of useful advice in there, but it also lets you talk about like military strategies as a businessman without coming off as some Machiavellian lunatic, which is the alternate tradition. But you'll notice, like, one of the things that never or very rarely shows up is like the extraordinary emphasis placed on honor. Like, disembowel, if you do something dishonorable, you disembowel yourself. If the business class of the West, which has no historical relationship whatsoever to the medieval samurai, right? Like none. Except maybe if we want to go like Japanism on art in the 19th century. But if they actually, like, let's say the business class decided to go all the way and adopt the practice of, like, disavoweling themselves rather than, say, abusing their employees or selling badly made products for overly high prices to the general public. Are the winds of history going to stand in their way and stop them? No. And I picked this example because without embracing it, I think we can actually present a pretty reasonable argument that we'd be living in a better world if we did have that kind of honor-shame culture in the business class than with the current, I'm just going to do whatever I want and not take responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Going back to historicism, then we have this paradox, rather than contradiction, but a paradox of the historicist arguments have all been disproven. Like we can go back, I'm sure anyone who's listening to a podcast like this has probably seen most of the major arguments against the March of Progress. If you looked at our discussion of, say, post-narratives and grand narratives, and then you look at Hegelianism, you can see how the whole thing falls to pieces. So, when we have, like, historicism's ideas aren't of any relevance to us, but we should still wrangle with them, because we want to know, like, why was this affirmed in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
From the perspective of those who believed it, and is there anything that we can salvage from this debate? We may still choose to abandon it. Like there are absolutely philosophical arguments for human sacrifice, and just because you understand them doesn't mean. Hopefully, you're not going to want to do them, right? Like I've read the arguments for human sacrifice. They're fascinating, but I'm happy living in a world where we don't follow through on them.
Not convinced.
I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced by the inevitability of sacrifice as a response to the sacrifice of the gods. Sorry, human sacrifice proponents. Yeah. So with that in mind, unless you had any comments, we can move on to...
I'm curious, Tobe's reading of Paul, could you speak to that for a second? That sounds interesting.
Yeah. Jacob Tobbs was a historian and philosopher active in the middle of the... So, remember 2 weeks when we did Nietzsche, I mentioned that in the aftermath of the Second World War, there was a massive reaction against ideas associated with funny Austrian mustache man.
Mm-hmm.
Jacob Tobbs was one of those, and he formulated in academic circles, highly influential reading of Paul as the quintessential theorist of the oppressed and the ugly and all that is wicked.
Okay.
Because he sort of embraced the Nazi stereotype of Jews and then inverted it, basically.
Okay, so that's why you would speak to it right after critical theory. Yeah. Okay, I can see.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Paul's vision of Paul had a huge impact on how European philosophers view Christianity. And to be fair, obviously there's some basis for his claim. Or his arguments, like Christianity does see itself as a religion of the oppressed. But I think it would be a mistake to say it's a religion which, say, idolizes being weak or oppressed or ugly, and intrinsically condemns not being any of those things, say, which would be the conclusion favored by Paul Tobbs, who's attempting to respond to a philosopher called Carl Schmitt, who we deal with here. You're supposed to say, like, if you go and you read the Book of Revelations, Jesus calls for the crows to feed on all men, be they mighty or wicked, slave or free, who have not followed the commandments of God, amongst other quotes.
Pretty totalizing worldview. isn't just about class disparities.
Yeah. So the problem. And so I brought up to eating eggs. It's connected to everything we've been discussing peripherally. But B, because it's an interesting example of an idea whose conclusions are profoundly false, but which is nonetheless worthy of study in its own right.
Yeah. Well, fascinating digression. Sorry, I derailed you for a second. Yeah. So we're going to go on to Wilhelm Dilthey is the next section I have up.
Yes. So conventionally, if you start looking up like historicism, especially in the German strain, you're going to look at Hegel and Schelling. I'm not going to touch them for this because they're very interesting figures. But there's so many more and so many better resources from people who have dedicated like decades of their life to studying Hegel. And they're also so much more popular. Wilhelm Dilthey is, in the English-speaking world, a comparatively more obscure figure. But when studying him, we have the advantage... so he was a German philosopher, historian, theorist of science, and he was the last great defender of realist historicism. And the advantage of studying Wilhelm Dilthey, beyond just picking a slightly more obscure figure to shine some light on, is Dilthey lived and wrote in the second half of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th, which means that he was writing after Marx's and Nietzsche's assaults on Hegelianism. So if we're studying Hegel, we can say, well, how would Hegel respond to say Marx? But we don't have Hegel's response to Marx. Dilthey wasn't a Hegelian; he was a neo-Kantian, or vaguely. We still have a response to Marx from the perspective of someone who was committed to historicism and the realistic bent, and was nevertheless neither a Marxist nor a Nietzschean. So that's why we're picking Dilthey, in case anyone was wondering.
Fascinating.
He tried to respond both to the relativistic strains of Nietzsche, or what we would see as the relativistic strains, and the unique views of Karl Marx.
Mm-hmm. Well, sounds like a worthy endeavor. So, sorry.
So in his later life, Dilthey turned to a field called hermeneutics, which for those who are unaware is, in its weakest sense, it's the or most narrow, it's the study of the interpretation of texts, typically sacred texts, the Bible, the Tao Te Ching, the Torah. In its stronger in its stronger and broader sense, it refers to the very act of interpretation of reality as a type of text. And Dilthey in his later life turned more and more to hermeneutics as a way of approaching the question of historicism. His main thesis, which is what he gifted to later hermeneutes like Paul Ricoeur and Hans-Georg Gadamer, was the conflict between explanation, which here stands for sort of like scientific explanation, and understanding, Verstehen, the interpretive act of understanding the world, like the objects of the world and our ability to interpret that world. And he attempted to rectify and I shouldn't have put understanding there, so I'm sorry. I'm just looking at the handout now. His attempt to rectify that conflict, is what I should have said. Not rectify understanding. Namely, we have the theory of explanation. This one is fairly straightforward. It's the scientific method, right? The analyzing of the world, and then we have the understanding. Now, I'm going to use two words here, and before I do, I'm going to state very specifically that I'm not using these words in the sense that they're typically understood in the West, and those words are objective and subjective. we use these words to connote real versus like arbitrary. Subjective tends to be synonymous with relative in conventional English. In fact, what they mean is studying things as objects, right, versus studying things as subjects. And the strange discrepancy between the two, and I say strange because in many cases, like everything that's a subject is also an object, simultaneously.
Sure.
All human beings and animals and plants are objects. And no matter how much you treat them like a subject, they remain an object. So, and it's not necessarily true to say that objective means correct and subjective means like relative. That's what you call like a post-enlightenment relic of our view that you call like the human perspective is in some sense more flawed than the perspective of that which is outside humans. To elevate ourselves into what you call God's eye, to use an academic commonplace. So when we're talking about explanation and understanding, behind here is Dilthey wanted to talk about the scientific understanding for which the world is nothing but objects. The cluttered mass. This would end in a contemporary context. This is going to be the typically Marxist view of history, right, as objects, versus say the understanding of subjects. Be they. Dilthey is looking at this exclusively from the perspective of humans. We can talk about animals or plants or even the natural environment or the heavens as subjects. Anthropologists sometimes say that like an animist lives in a world of subjects and not of objects. That's not true. They live in a world where all objects are subjects. But they're still objects. They're just objects and subjects, as opposed to, say, more materialist, more mechanistic views, which remove subjecthood, but otherwise are very similar to animism.
To reinforce this with like a popular turn of phrase you hear today, this notion of talking about bodies. Human bodies seems like a very like a way to objectify talking about black bodies, women's bodies. You hear this kind of parlance in progressive circles, and it makes me think about objective versus subjective. People tend to point that out and say that they find just because it's objective, it sounds like they point it out as if the person speaking isn't a trained Marxist and it isn't aware of what they're doing. The impression I've always gotten is that Marxism, thinking objectively, like in terms of objects, in that sense, that they would be that's actually pretty consistent with Marxist language. Would that be fair? Talking about categories of people in terms of bodies, or is that?
Yeah, yes and no.
Yeah.
It's definitely fair if we're talking about. So last time we spoke about, say, how Marxism responded to the collapse of, the Marxist political project of revolution in the 50s and 60s, and the sort of idealistic turn. It definitely is consistent. I'm actually going to steel man them here, though, and say they have a point.
Mm-hmm.
I think they go about it all, like we always talk about objectifying as if it were something bad. It's like, oh, you're objectifying women's bodies, you're objectifying them. And, and not to say, like, obviously, if you're just sitting there salivating over every woman you see or aren't treating them like a human, that's absolutely immoral. But also, people do have bodies. And there are definite reasons as to why what you call like the somatic bent in continental philosophy happened, and it's one of the things that even more very like right-wing philosophers in the Anglosphere tend to be sensitive to. even if they rightly hate how Marxists have approached the question. And I'm trying to figure, like, it's a rightly very sensitive issue, because all humans are subjects, but their bodily elements are irreducible parts of their subjecthood.
Yeah.
We are not brains floating in a vat.
That's a fair steel manning.
Yeah, and there are theorists out there who've talked about, like, and we're actually going to touch on this again when we go to the end of the Dilthey subject, so this runs through the entire problem, and it's the question of how do you approach the fact that people are objects in a way that doesn't destroy the image of God. And it's one of the... Actually, we'll just proceed, because we'll be touching on this again and again near the end of the presentation. So that should maybe make things a little bit clearer. So yeah, Dilthey, he tried to bring the understanding into the sphere of the object, basically. And so we see this quote. This is from his translator, Frederick Jameson, an influential Marxist phenomenologist. The supreme mystery of the historiographical act, theory of history, that understanding which, far from being a subjective or purely intuitive leap, implies a whole complex of intellectual reconstruction. This is his translation of Nachbildung, replica, which is sort of like, means like to re-educate or to rebuild. Bildung means education in German. It has a very rich tradition of meanings in Enlightenment thinking, like in Kant, Hegel, relating to the development of the human individual into his full personhood. Bildung is the basis on which we acquire Mündigkeit, maturity. Apologies to Germans for mispronouncing those. In Dilthey's own words, we now have to deal with the problem of the scientific knowledge of individuals, and indeed the principal forms of singular existence in general. Is such knowledge possible? So is objective knowledge, and again, we're not interested here as true knowledge, we're interested in knowledge of objects, possible, and what means are at our disposal to attain it. So even if the knowledge is there, how might we have it? It is a problem of the greatest significance. Action everywhere presupposes our understanding of other people. Well, I should have italicized that. Much of our happiness as human beings derived from our re-experiencing of alien states of mind. So we have three things that are going on here. We have the problem of knowledge of objects, which is scientific knowledge. Even of people as objects, which is what anthropology aimed for at the time. Maybe not nowadays. And then we have the fact that our action in this respect presupposes the ability to understand other minds, other people. And then we end by noting that for human beings, this is a quintessentially imaginative act. Like it's sort of like the subjunctive or as if or if-then, playing, not to use that word frivolously, but like playing or putting ourselves into the minds of others. In the German pedagogical tradition of which Dilthey was a part, for example, the practice of kids to, say, play house, or cowboys and aliens, all the little being pirates, was actually encouraged as a crucial element of growing up because it gave you the ability to entertain states of mind that were completely foreign to you as a person. I totally forgot his name, but there was who was he? German educational theorist who wrote on nothing but this exact topic. Okay, I'll see if hopefully I can remember it. human studies, this is going to be what we'll call the soft sciences, have indeed the advantage over the natural sciences, that their object is not sensory perception as such, no mere reflection of reality within consciousness. Remembering here that while the object world may exist outside of us, we perceive it from within ourselves, right? But is rather first and foremost an inner reality, a coherence experienced from within, yet the very way in which this inner reality is experienced within us raises the gravest difficulties as to its objective apprehension. Any inner experiencing through which I become aware of my own disposition can never by itself bring me to a consciousness of my own individuality. He means this in the sense of you can be aware I exist, but you cannot develop the idea of existing as an individual from that sentiment. To clarify the slightly confusing argument here, I experience the latter only through a comparison of myself with other people. We see again this called imaginative semiotic process, but the existence of other people is given us only from the outside in sensory events, gestures, words, and actions. Only through a process of reconstruction, Nachbildung, do we complete this sense perception, which initially takes the form of isolated signs. We are thus obliged to translate everything out of our own sense of life. So, the argument as a whole should be manifest if you look in the contours of all these quotes, which is, we have the problem of attempting to gain knowledge of the world, because the world itself presents itself to us as objects, right? We're a subject, other people are subjects, but those subjects present themselves to us only in an objective sense. This creates, to Dilthey, an insuperable paradox between the attempt to explain the world of objects and the attempt to understand that world, which we only do from our own sense of self.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
And it's a fascinating quote, and this is why I said we want to study historicism, because we may, like Dilthey proceeds from this to attempt to develop a theory of historical knowledge that nobody follows today. But this question, this paradox that he perceived, and that it is in fact real, like we see this all the time. Anyone who's ever read anything on, say, disability studies has read about the tendency of the difficulty of developing or assigning or understanding subjective states in a world full of objects, and the problem that we encounter in terms of, say, like animal minds, human minds, be they like humans that look like us, they share our race, they share our gender, they share our religion, versus, say, like the disabled, people from a different race, unborn fetuses, for anyone who's a Christian or Jewish.
Sure.
Natural phenomena, if you're committed to some sort of, as I said, animism. And this is a sort of problem we're going to see it replicate again and again, even if we reject historicism. So I'm going to switch to where historicism intersects with other philosophy, and why this is such a compelling problem. All right. It is in the sphere of, so these are quotes from Paul Ricoeur, a philosopher of hermeneutics writing in the 70s, and they can be found in Hermeneutics in the Human Sciences. They're mostly from the same essay. It is in the sphere of psychology that Dilthey searches for the distinctive feature of understanding. So this is as to the interpretive act of understanding the operation of subjects or other minds in the world. Every human science, and by that Dilthey means every modality of the knowledge of man, so different ways of gaining knowledge, which implies an historical relation, which for the record is all of them. Like, even if we reject historical knowledge, all the ways we gain knowledge are always going to be tied to history, even if we reject historicism, like in a determinative or strong sense. But it presupposes a primordial capacity to transpose oneself into the mental life of others. I pointed this out in our earlier quotes. Much of our happiness as human beings derives from our re-experiencing nachfüllen of alien states of mind. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The key to the critique of historical knowledge, which was painfully missing in Kantianism, is to be found in the fundamental phenomenon of interconnection, Zusammenhang, by which the life of others can be discerned and identified in all its manifestations. So Zusammenhang is a Hegelian term. It's like Lutheran reinterpretation of the Kabbalistic idea of Tzimtzum, divine contraction.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think we need to offer an explanation? Like, Dilthey obviously is not some esoteric Kabbalist. Just in case that was... But he is using an idea from somebody who is very sympathetic to esoteric Kabbalah.
Yeah, fascinating.
So, we have the interconnect... So Dilthey's attempt, like this whole reconstruction or rebuilding of reality that Dilthey felt could transform our objective into the subjective, thereby giving us historical knowledge, connect the two, the explanation and the understanding, was the interconnection of existence. So if you go back to our earlier quotes for a moment, just mentally, as we talked about, the existence of other people is given us only from the outside in sensory events, gestures, words, and actions. Only through a process of reconstruction do we complete this sense perception. So in the understanding, in the subject psychology, we attempt to grasp the life of others through the manifestations of existence, which are the interconnected features of the world, right? The events, gestures, understandings, be they natural phenomena or the movements or words of other human beings. Ricoeur finally concludes, Dilthey perfectly perceived the crux of the problem, namely that life grasps life only by the mediation of units of meaning which rise above the historical flux. So to step back for a moment here, why do most people hate historicism? Or most people with philosophical bent, hate historicism because they think it destroys they think it destroys real knowledge, right? Because it makes knowledge just a contingent manifestation of historical phenomena. Dilthey's point, and the reason he was his ultimate sort of conclusion, was that it's not historicism per se. It's rather the fact that the units of meaning by which we're attempting to grasp other human beings need to rise above the flux of the objects in which we stand.
Mm-hmm.
Switch to should be the final slide on the crisis of historicism.
Yep. Okay.
So the crisis of historicism that Dilthey articulated was not worries about ultimate truth, say, or particular truth, or scientific truth, like we were looking to talk about, say, absolute truth. That's not Dilthey's main concern here. Dilthey's concern here is existential truth. Man's ability to know man. And not know in terms of... there's the question of know in terms of gaining, factual knowledge. but he means to possess actual knowledge of, say, other people, rather than having other people present. I mean, not even having other people present them, just existing in a state of complete uncertainty as to whether others exist and what they may be. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason this is a subject that I think maybe merits some study is that this problem is going to persist no matter your views on, say, the existence of God or absolute truth, or whether you believe in reason or faith or some mix of the two. It even persists if you have no interest in philosophy. If you have an interest in, say, experiencing love or friendship, this question of knowledge still manifests. Ricoeur, he doesn't think Dilthey succeeds. He's not alone there. Most people study Dilthey because of his ability to articulate problems rather than because of the solutions he provides to those problems. The question of objectivity that persists in Dilthey's work as a problem which is both ineluctable and insoluble. Dilthey, we have this... Ricoeur thinks that Nachbildung is not sufficient to grant us this knowledge of the other, of the understanding of the other in the objective state. Objective being the world outside our eyes, or even parts of the inside as within.
Yeah.
And this discussion. So, 2 weeks back, we spoke about Nietzsche, and I mentioned how we find an opposition in Nietzsche to the conceptual world. Right. And Nietzsche says that the real world is free of, say, concepts, and he asserts that Plato made this ever greater, just total abstraction of nothingness. I believe he repeatedly uses the words hot fumes or hot air. In fact, one of the main issues that Plato is wrangling with when he talks about his theory of being, if you actually go and read Plato, is this objective knowledge of others. Platonic epistemology, or rather Socratic epistemology, goes extensively back and forth over the object or other, the problem of exteriority involving the other or the object versus the individual's attempt to gain knowledge. And it's precisely in contact with this conflict that Plato posits his realm of being, which describes the true forms behind the appearances of things. So Plato wrangled with this question implicitly in dialogues like the Theaetetus, like the Republic, in spite of the fact that Plato had no historical understanding. There is no theory of history in Plato. At least not as we would recognize it. Leaving Europe entirely and going to 1st century China, the Confucian scholar Dong Zhongshu, it was the exact same issue that led Dong Zhongshu to posit Jin, which we translate sincerity. That's the usual translation. Trust or truthfulness are also good translations of the term, which gives you some idea of the whole complex meanings attached to it, as the 5th Confucian virtue. So Confucius doesn't have a list of virtues. He has a whole bunch of virtues he appeals to in the Analects. Mencius is his first, or his best known, not his disciple, but the next figure in the great Confucian chain of philosophy, has 4 virtues: benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety. Zhongshu adds sincerity. And the reason he adds sincerity is in his comments trying to rectify the Mencius to the doctrine of the mean, a work on the nature of sincerity, and explain how do we proceed from this position of the self into the world of objects, which is a necessary act if we want to live righteous, benevolent lives. Maybe not like the lives of saints, just righteous and benevolent lives to other people. In a Confucian context, that's our wife, our kids, our superiors at work, our underlings if we're a manager. And Nietzsche himself, he just rejects this. Right? He, you remember that we had that quote about, like how rhetoric was invented for those who were who didn't know how to use a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks back. That's but it's a very, very loosely paraphrased Nietzsche, because I can't remember the exact wording. Nietzsche he rejects this knowledge of the other people. Not entirely, he wrangles with it consistently, but the question of, say, the other, between, say, the view of all the objects that mediate between, is not one that Nietzsche is quintessentially concerned with, nor is it one that his followers are concerned with. Actually, it's like Deleuze's quote. It's like the other can go to shit or something, like, if you pardon my French. And this is why, I study Historicism. At the center of Dilthey's attempt to grant us historical knowledge, or historicist view, is his worry over this knowledge of other people. Scientifically, but existentially.
Yeah. If I can interject for a moment, I think this.
I'm done.
Great. I thought you had landed the plane. This idea of what is it? I missed the pronunciation. Is it Jin? The sincerity, trust, truthfulness.
I said Jin.
Jin. Yeah. Well, same here. I think that's interesting. Folks listening to this may find that relevant to certain circles talking about sincerity culture versus authenticity culture, and then the third, prophilicity culture. I mean, these are kind of like lower resolution, popularized, I'd say kind of translations of what's being discussed here. Just very simply put, sincerity culture has been kind of put in the category box of honor-shame culture. Is another way of talking about that. You're sincerely living up to, profiles of identity that have been given to you by nature of your station, and authenticity being something that you discover within yourself and then project out into the world. Prophilicity culture, which is still kind of being defined, which is a phenomenon of my understanding. And of course, people kind of post these up to track with modern, postmodern, and then whatever is happening post-meta modern, whatever term that we'll be using in hindsight to describe the social media infused world that we live in now, where the profile, the virtual version of ourselves is more real than the object version of ourselves, I guess. The IRL version.
Yeah, so when I'm getting...
So what do you think about that?
Okay. Well, it's so... actually, what might be better, Jin might be better thought of as a word that combines both faith and truth. With that being said, so Theodore Adorno's main contribution to the international philosophy circle was the notion that the Enlightenment idea of the authentic I was a form of totalitarianism, and which he connects to his vision of, say, authenticity. And this has led to a massive reaction in philosophy against any form of, say, the authentic self. This is one of the main targets of critical theory, in action, but shared. And in the 70s, Confucianism got co-opted by postmodern thinkers who wanted to argue that because Confucianism, Confucianism and Judaism are ritualist philosophies, right? They are centered in the performance of rituals. And so Confucianism got co-opted by postmodern academics who argued that because it's a fundamentally ritual philosophy, therefore Confucianism lacks the Enlightenment notion of authenticity, or the notion of the self, and is therefore in some sense compatible with or amenable to the project of critical theory in our time. I think the reason that Dong Zhongshu and thinkers like him are worth studying is I actually think they explode the entire dichotomy.
Yeah.
Because central to Confucianism is not... Confucianism believes in the true self. Especially what we call Neo-Confucianism, or Daozhu, which 12th century on Confucian movement that fused what we call Orthodox Confucianism with elements of Taoist and Buddhist thought. Real quickly, for those who don't know, Taoism and Buddhism have notions of the truth self, your Buddha self in Buddhism, and in Taoism it's called Zhenren, the true human. It's the idea that we're actually not human beings. We have to become, or there's a human being within us that we have to become.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's very... we're running out of time here, but there's potentially lots of really interesting discussions that can be had about the concordance between, say, the Christian notion of the fall, Diogenes' ideas of, say, authenticity, and authenticity as understood in Taoism and Confucianism. Because I think, Confucianism it resists this whole attempt to categorize a culture of authenticity versus, say, a culture of ritual, because Confucianism sees there being no contradiction between the two.
Yeah. I'm grateful for that. You adding some dimension to these concepts, because they really do kind of blow up these sort of reductionist frameworks that we hear about, that we kind of draw from online sources sometimes. I think there's a lot more to be found that's useful when just in looking at Chinese philosophy here, there's a lot better content going on here that I think that's worth chewing on, worth discussing, maybe doing a episode on.
Yeah, I'd be down. I love Chinese philosophy was my first love. Still my main one.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Yondar, for this excellent conversation, this excellent presentation. I hope folks that have been listening have liked and subscribed, of course. They've done the proverbial, but we're continuing to kind of flesh out the antecedents of the culture that we live in today, its problems, challenges, its misunderstandings of where it's come from, so that we can better understand where it's going. Not trying to be too much of a historicist myself by saying that, but just as we said, add some dimension to topics that folks probably aren't seeing enough dimension on, and hearing these philosophers in their own words, in their own written words at least, we think adds to that. Really, really helps to think through these concepts. So with that, I will see you out. Thank you again so much for this excellent presentation, Yondar, and we will see you all next week.